Ready for our last presentation. I want to give you my reminder about my challenge to you.
Yeah, but I don't know what this is.
Okay.
Is that the beginning?
Thank you. Again, just my reminder about my challenge for the high school students. Here's again what I want you to do. Prepare a story about something that you heard today that inspired you, interested you, challenged you in some form or another. As I said, it can be written as a newspaper story, as an op-ed kind of piece, as a broadcast story, as a photo slideshow, as a film, as a blog, whatever it is that is your preferred form of telling a story or the mechanism to tell a story. Email it to me at Moretti, that's Moretti, at rmu.edu. I'm going to have some of our students be the judges, essentially, and those that they tell us meet the professional standards of communications are going to be the ones that will appear on either the RMU Century Media website and actually the Moon News Cloud website. So, again, your stories count, I think, is one of the themes you've heard today. Our final program of the day allows us to celebrate the spoken word and tell us a little more about an organization in Pittsburgh that is committed to protecting poets who live in various places throughout the world. The man who will introduce our speaker is Dr. Jay Carson. He is a university professor of English studies. Dr. Carson earned his PhD from nearby Carnegie Mellon University. He's the author of more than 60 poems that have appeared in local or international journals, magazines, or anthologies. His most recent work, Irish Coffee, a chapbook, was released earlier this year. Dr. Carson, thank you for joining us at Celebrating Communications Day.
Mike, there it is. Right before Jay's coming up, I just want to say thank you again for being here today. Dr. Moretti is going to pass around these feedback forms. If you can fill them out for us while we are finishing up for today, and then it's just, all you have to do is just check right on in the boxes of your experience of how things went for today. And then on your way out, I'll be there at the door and you can hand them there to me on your way out as well, okay? And we'll also have some handouts that Henry Reese will provide as well. So sorry for interrupting for Jay. Carson, come on up here, sweetheart.
Thank you. Thanks, Heather. Thank you, Anthony. It's great to be here. Isn't it terrific to be at a school that has a front page story, in this case about its basketball team? But isn't it also great to be at a conference where there is a wonderful newspaper story about one of the major speakers? This is about Henry Reese's new plans for a literary center to open on the north side, which he has been working for many years. So his interests are not only national, but they are also local in creating a venue for both national and local poets. Henry seems to me to be the kind of person that we all ought to want to be. That is a very successful man in many areas, one of which was telemarketing, and while there in a successful career, he led campaigns that had massive social change impact. Mothers Against Drunk Driving, child abuse prevention organizations, and since then he has gone on to create City of Asylum in Pittsburgh, which is a wonderful organization that has worked very hard to bring abused writers out of their situations of being unable to write or speak in their home areas, brought them to the United States, and to Pittsburgh, where they live on the north side. He helps integrate them into American society and Pittsburgh society. So if you haven't done so, you ought to go over there and take a look at some of the houses that Henry has built for these people, where you could see poetry on the outside. And more than that, you ought to go to the readings. I've been lucky enough to get to some of these readings, some at the Mattress Factory, some in Henry's house. He donates his home as well to these very important issues of freedom of speech, of democracy. I think that he is a real patriot. So please help me welcome Henry Reese, creator of City of Asylum, Pittsburgh.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you very much, Heather. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I'm going to show a lot of pictures, but first I'm going to do some of that talking at you. It'll be relatively brief, and I'm going to try to allow a lot of time at the end for questions, suggestions to us, and ideas that you might have, because that's really one of the things we've used a lot. We started off with a very different mission than we have today. So I want to talk to you just for a minute about free speech and why we think it's important. In 2011, almost 900 writers around the world were killed, threatened with death, imprisoned, or otherwise persecuted. Uncountable others were censored or banned from publication. In the US, we're free to speak our minds, but I think we all know what the barriers are between the ideal and the real. There are many ways to bury writers in our society, as well as societies that are offshore. So why is creative expression so important? You've been spending a day dealing with the First Amendment. I think you've heard a lot of practical reasons why being able to speak your mind and investigate are important. The threats to journalists around the world are widespread as raw exercises in power. Power when it's threatened. At City of Asylum Pittsburgh, we also feel that literary writing, creative free expression, is vital in an even deeper way than journalism, fundamental to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Free speech is the currency for everything in life that we value that you cannot buy with money. It's all about the exchange of values and experiences, how we live our lives together. And it only has value when we use it. As with money, bad speech drives out good speech. They're subject to impacts like inflation, shortages, and surpluses. Journalism is tactical in the way that it uses free speech to resist conformity and oppression. Reporters threaten authority in the here and the now. Journalists compete to be the first to do a story, but if they don't get the story, there might be someone else who gets it. If George Orwell hadn't written 1984, it wouldn't have been written. How many of you can remember even a newspaper article from a month ago that was an important article? Great works of literature can threaten authority forever, even when the author's dead. And often, unfortunately, not just in a natural lifetime, they are that way because of persecution. Creative writers are the protectors of the very reason we live, our pursuit of joy that sustains us. Totalitarians eradicate libraries to eradicate memory. They just dream of destroying things like time itself, any past with a set of texts that differ any future texts to come. Their dream is to build a society that exists like robots or bees, a society of all identity. The threat that we have right now in this country, and not because of any political regime, the threat to us, I would say, as a mature society, is that we censor ourselves. That's really the danger. For us who exists in freedom, internalizing the censor is really the danger. It's a constant temptation. It's what in business we used to call golden handcuffs, keeping people on the job. The golden handcuffs of a quiet society are comfort. Great art can do a lot of things, and many things that are sometimes contradictory. But one thing that great art does is it gets you in the heads of other people. Once you're there, a lot of things can happen, and it can be a really scary place sometimes. But whatever happens, it's the beginning of a dialogue and a bridge for exchange where there has been no connection beforehand. And that's why we started City of Asylum Pittsburgh. So that's my kind of speech. And now I'd like to talk a little bit about how we started and where we went. And the reason I want to do that is everything I sort of outlined as a speech actually happened in real life, where writers came into a community and the relationship of those writers to that community began to change them both, and it began to alter our programs and evolve because we saw that free speech does matter, both to the writer being protected and to the community that protects. So with that, I will try to get on here. Am I going to block this if this is a bad place to stand? Is this better? Nope. We got to the end somehow here. Maybe I better let you run it then. Okay, we're past the end. Okay, let's go to the first one. Let's go to the... Okay, this is our mission today. We provide sanctuary to endangered literary writers so that the writers can continue to write and their voices are not silenced. We offer a broad range of literary programs in a community setting to encourage cross-cultural exchange. We anchor neighborhood development by transforming blighted properties into homes for our programs and energizing public spaces through public art with text-based components, and we'll go through these real quickly later. Why we got started and how we got started. City of Asylum is a movement that began in Europe with Salman Rushdie. Does anybody know who Salman Rushdie is and his story? Salman Rushdie wrote a book called The Satanic Verses. When he wrote that book, the Ayatollah Khomeini declared a fatwa on his life, and he had to go into hiding. He ended up being in hiding for 8 years, protected by the British government because of the death threats. A group of writers got together in Europe, and they began an organization to protect writers like that who were endangered, and he became the president at that time. The organization now has about 40 chapters in Europe that are funded by the governments of the various countries there. We heard about this when Salman Rushdie came to Pittsburgh to talk just as he was beginning to go public. And we got interested, but we got interested with one difference. The governments in Europe fund the program, and they provide 2 years of sanctuary to a writer where they provide a living wage, a place to stay, health benefits, things like that, which we provide. But we do one thing differently. We do not treat this as an institutional benefit. We believe that it's a community and a grassroots organization, because if you're in exile, in danger, you're trying to make a new home. You're not trying to kind of find a 2-year temporary place. So that was something very different here, and it really deeply impacted what we do. The first writer was recommended to us by a group of writers, one of them Salman Rushdie and several Nobel Prize-winning writers. This is the house that he came to when we first came to Pittsburgh. His name was Wang Zhang, and he was a Chinese writer. He was in his 60s at the time. He had been in prison for 12 years, 7 different incarcerations, been just brutally tortured, scars all over his body. His mouth had been beaten in where we couldn't even get it repaired. They tried to silence him in all ways. He'd never been allowed to publish. We were talking about the dinner when he first came here, and we were driving down the Mon, and he looked up at Mount Washington, and he said, and this is all, he only spoke Chinese, so his wife spoke a little English, so I think this is what he said. He said, "I'd like to carve my poetry up on that mountain." There's a tradition of Chinese poets doing that. So we looked at him and we said, not gonna happen. And my wife is a visual artist, and she said, how about if you do your poetry on the outside of your house that we're gonna stay in? And he was also a calligrapher, so they got together and said, that's a great idea. So this is what happened. He was, that's him. We put up scaffolding on there right after he got here, and he began to do the calligraphy. It's almost like an anthology of poetry. Those are some of his different poems. While he's doing that, 3 little girls come, probably 13, 14 years old. There's a school in the neighborhood. They're walking after school. And I don't know if you can still remember, but they were a little bit sassy, and they kind of look at me and say, what's going on? Like, you know, tell me, what's this goofy thing happening? So I said, he's a famous Chinese poet. And they looked at me. Famous was really good, but Chinese didn't mean a whole lot, and poet meant even less. So I said, would you like his autograph? And they said, okay. So he came down and with a little Sharpie, he wrote it out in Chinese character, would pass for an autograph. And they looked at me and they said, that's not in English. And I said, no, I said, he's Chinese. And so there was no sort of conception that there was actually another language being spoken. So At that point, I said, would you like him to read his house? He'll do a poem for you. And they said, yeah, sure, okay. So he was a great performer. I'll show you, hopefully, a few snippets here in a minute. But he walks up. There's these 3 kids here. Ah! And then he rolls on the ground, and he does a poem called Wild Beast, and he's truly a wild beast. And he's jumped back, and and he says, so they say to me, can he do another one? So then I know, okay, there's this gap of understanding, and there's this way to bridge this gap, which was poetry. And that was kind of a really important moment for us, just watching that. Want to go to the next one? So that's what it looks like today. Became a very popular place. We didn't really know what we were doing. All of a sudden it became a landmark. People would come there and bring their families, whatever. It became a sort of tourist spot. And then, you want to go to the next one? Wang Zhang, on the opening night when we dedicated this will kind of give you a sense of his style. This is a poem where he talks about using the human body as a pen and calligraphy on the... So it's a kind of funny poem, and I should have put the translation. Okay, we can go from there. And then all of a sudden, he's getting crowds, right? 2 people would walk down the street. He had been in prison so long, he was starved to have human contact. And he really wanted to celebrate his freedom, and he was really grateful to Pittsburgh. But he would come out on the street, he would see 2 people, he knew 1 word of English, okay! And he would do a little performance. And it became really well known and engaged people. And we said, okay, people putting poems through his door. And it was really kind of an interesting thing, and you're sort of watching this happen over time. We then said, how can we begin to get him and really show him to a group of people at a time as opposed to these little itsy-bitsy things. And we thought, well, nobody can really do this for 40 minutes in a public space. It's one thing if we trap you in a room here, right? But if we're going to engage the neighborhood, some of whom care about poetry, some of whom don't, and certainly in Chinese, how are we going to keep people's attention for a while? We said, well, we need to do it with music. So we, in a roundabout way, got in contact with a really well-known musician, the founder of the World Saxophone Quartet, who flew here on his own dime and spent a couple of days and worked out an act with Wang Zhang at the time. And this is the setting where we set up the concert, and this is a future one, but this is the street where we do it. We set up 700 chairs now. It's gotten really quite big, and big screen and all that. So it really worked, and it took off, and it engaged people, that kind of performance. Later on, we'll try to cut in for a few seconds so you get a sense of what that's like. But that's what the scene looks like. So the community begins to really enliven. People sitting in that audience live sort of on opposite sides of a dividing line. This street separates the poor and the wealthy, and it's not kind of absolute, but there's sort of characterization in terms of income. There are racial divides there that kind of, it's more black on one side, more white on the other side. So people live in the same neighborhood, but they tend not to be in the same space. So this is one time where they're in the same space. And we began to see these transformations and what could happen when we started off really doing something very simple. How can we provide sanctuary to a writer? And all of a sudden we're doing other programs. So we have a poet on our board, Troy Derricotte, who's a really well-known poet. And so she says things much more elegantly than I do. She's observing what's happened. And so she says, and you can probably read as well as I can, but City of Asylum, Pittsburgh has transformed a street called Sampsonia Way. That's where these houses are. And this is really pretty early in the game for us. It's now an invitation to us all into a space in the imagination where a neighborhood, what some might call an ordinary alley, and this is like 20 feet wide, 800 feet long, but it's a little alley, has been reinvented. It's become a space of wonder where art and poetry are central, open to all of us to enjoy, to pause and think, to pass through and be inspired, to breathe, At the same time, it reminds us of the possibilities of a neighborhood in which, while in exile from those other neighborhoods, freedom can be sheltered and given a home. So all of a sudden, where we started off saying, we got this house, we'll provide sanctuary to a writer, it's really simple, it's starting to take over this community, and people beginning to get engaged and starting to take over our lives. I mean, I was retired from business and thinking I was going to have a hobby. And okay, so one of the concerts one year, we did a little video and they started interviewing people. So this gives you a sense of just what people say and feel.
It seems like the concert is kind of the culmination of the work that each of these City of Asylum poets has been doing over the past times that they have been here. So the kind of work that they're doing is engaging with the community. It's basically showing this is what humanity looks like, and this is what the concert is showing people. This is what humanity looks like. This is what freedom and creativity looks like. So it's very essential and very valuable to have this go on as long as possible.
So what does it mean to write in a foreign tongue? How does it feel to mull over that astounding collision of your mother and stepmother tongue?
Just to support free speech and to embrace people that have, such wonderful artistic value and are persecuted in their home countries, so that for us to embrace and support them here, I think it's just one of the most important things that just makes our city shine.
Yo tampoco estoy completo de la mente, me dije entonces, en ese primer día de trabajo, sentado frente al que sería mi escritorio durante esa temporada, con la vista perdida en las altas y blancas paredes casi desnudas de esa oficina que yo ocuparía los próximos 3 meses y cuyo mobiliario consistía nada más en el escritorio, la computadora, la silla en que yo divagaba y un crucifijo a mi espalda, gracias al cual las altas paredes no estaban completamente desnudas.
I love it because the dissident poets, and I've seen this will be my 3rd year, and I'm just really impressed by how people come and express poetry that have been badly treated.
That neighbor, they learned some Chinese when they were neighbors to Wang Zhang, just so they could talk to him.
Great.
The whole idea of providing a place for exile writers is great.
It's about raindrops coming from the ceiling of a cell and pounding on his head. Dink, dink, the raindrops.
Speaking in tongues. This poem begins in 1987. My grandmother dragged us to meet the Lord under a tent in St. Catherine. From here, I trace the heritage of standing spellbound as women worship always. I am on the outskirts. I remember my grandmother oddly becoming the kind of woman who sets her table each Sunday, who walks up from the river, water balanced easily on her head.
Poetry and jazz, that's the mainstay. Artists is a must. It's a must in terms of culture.
Yeah, the guy on the left, James Carter, when we were rehearsing this, one of the poets that year was from Mongolia, and we do people in language, and he was sort of, in Mongolia, he was a shaman, but they whisper. So I didn't know this, but he's always reading his poetry like this. So we're rehearsing, and the musicians are pairing off at that time with the various poets. And this guy, you saw, he's big, and he plays this big horn, and he looks and he says, I can't do this. And so the Mongolian poet, there was sort of an intellectual player there who paired off, who then just breathed through the saxophone. And then we gave the microphone to the poet, and he got a little, we kept turning up the microphone until you could hear him. And the two of them began to compete then to be heard. It was really interesting. But anyway, the concert has grown now. One year we had the Flying Walendas, the tightrope walkers performed to a text of Salman Rushdie. So it's gotten to be a very complex event, and it's really become the landmark event of this community, which it identifies itself with. Well, we call these houses house publications, and because we are a grassroots organization, and again, we're different than an institution as they are in Europe, in that we don't throw people out of their houses. So a writer comes here, our commitment is that we want them to be able to continue to write, and in freedom, and otherwise we fail. So we expect people to figure out a way to become financially independent, but it can take more than 2 years to do that as a writer. It can take more than 2 years anyway, but it's hard enough to be an American writer. It's just that much harder when you're not, and when you're writing in another language. So we allow the writers to stay as long as they need in the house rent-free until they become independent. We didn't anticipate what that meant, though. That meant when the second writer came, we had to have another house. We're not always real clever, right? So we then, because of the reaction of the first house, we decided we would call these house publications and put text-based artwork on the outside of each one. This is the second one. A writer from El Salvador came, who we saw reading in Spanish in that video. The house there is, the text in it is from a Nobel Prize winner, Wole Soyinka, who came. He wrote out the text in his handwriting, and we had it sandblasted into the door. And the sculpture is by this neighborhood sculptor, Thad Mosley. And that's a close-up of the text with an interpretation, again, behind it. The text is about being in solitary confinement. Despite the fact that he won a Nobel Prize, it does not protect you from being put in prison. That's what the house looked like before we started, just to give you an idea. We'll go through these really quickly. There's a couple. We got them, completely rehabbed them. That's what it looks like today. And then there's a writer's room in the upstairs as well. So each of these houses have been completely rehabbed. The second writer's in his house. The first writer, that house became something else. We used it for a magazine. And so a third writer came, in this case from Burma, and with 2 children. Whoops. And when they came here, they were on a really long flight. I guess I'm not supposed to be in front. I get feedback. And the writer had a dream, because we brought her here directly out of Burma, so it was fairly complicated. And where Pittsburgh and Burma merged. And so she wrote a story about it, and her husband's a visual artist. So this is him beginning to sketch it out. This is a little bit further along the line, and there's some neighborhood kids kind of copying what he's doing on the house onto the street. And then I think we have that's what it looks like today. This is Pittsburgh on the front. If you're closer, you can kind of see the golf building and some buildings that you recognize. And the close-up on the other side, it's Burma. And you'll see a picture of people behind a prison wall and some crows flying free. And they talk about the crows being freer than the people and having more to eat. So it's in the rivers merge from the 2 countries on the corner. The fourth house, now the third writer's in the house and a fourth writer comes. So we have to get a fourth house. And this one, we commissioned the jazz musician Oliver Lake, who came and helped us start jazz poetry and curates it every year and brings a different musical group. When he goes around the world, he's also a painter. And he draws things like the stains on hotel floors because he's traveling. He's a really famous musician. He's always traveling somewhere. But he grew up in Marianna, Arkansas. And there's one of those sort of urban legend type characters that sometimes exist. The sort of old coots that wear the winter coats all year round, even in the hot summer. And this guy used to wear safety pins all over his coat. And he had something he called the Safety Pin Club. And he would kid a safety pin, and he said, "You now belong to the safety pin club." And then you'd look at him and say, "Well, what's that?" And he'd say, "Just be good." So Oliver also uses this theme of safety pins in it. So the whole house is covered with artwork, and so we have a series of these. We're doing a 5th one now as we speak. We also do a lot more presenting now. In addition to, we have a various, kinds of programs. We do something called Writers in the Gardens, where we have poets in different gardens and do a tour of the neighborhood in small groups from garden to garden with readings. During G20, to help people understand the situation in Burma and why we had a Burmese writer, we had 17 exiled monks come and sleep in the houses in our street and do a sort of peace walk through the neighborhood, and we showed a movie. And as you can see, it was quite a scene, and it was exotic for the monks as it was for the people. We do readings in our house. This started again accidentally. The second writer in the program is a pretty well-known writer, Horacio Castellanos Moya, and when he got translated into English, New Directions, which is a well-known literary house, published him, and so we decided we had to do a book launch and let him do a reading, and so many people came, we had to do it for 2 nights, and then we began to do those more frequently, and the more we did them, the more people came. So now we're doing one almost every month with different writers from around the world primarily. Yeah, we're doing one tonight with a writer from India. We also do readings on the street. Sometimes they get to be too big to put indoors. And this is a group of poets from an organization called Kavi Kanam, where we had the Poet Laureate and a couple of National Book Award winners. So we get poetry readings out on the street with 300 and 400 people. So these are sensational events where the mix of people is not what you would think of as a stuffy academic audience, I would say. This last year at Jazz Poetry, we started to integrate our mission a little better, and everybody in the audience held up a placard with the story of a person, one of those 900 writers last year who was persecuted, and this was mine. And I surveyed people afterwards, about 10 days later, and something like 80% of the people said they still had this placard with the story of their individual writer. Each one is an individual story. We'll skip, yep, that's great. This is an event we have coming up, and you're all invited. There's some little cards here, but keep it in mind. This is going to be probably the largest gathering of exiled Chinese artists in the world this year. We've got everything from well-known in certain circles, exiled poets. I don't know if you can remember last year there was a lawyer who escaped from China, a blind lawyer, that the government of the U.S. and Hillary Clinton were really active in. He'll be here. And then that night, we're having a Tibetan exiled rock band, and Jaziri X, a local social activist rapper, they're going to do a concert. And it'll all be on that street where you saw that tent on Monterey Street. Yep. And we've had 206 artists from 47 different countries now since 2005. Okay. As we developed these houses, we discovered we were in the economic development business. And it's not something we had planned, but we've invested over $1 million into housing, and we began to outgrow doing some of the things we do and needed to begin to institutionalize it a bit more. So this article in the paper refers to something we're calling Alphabet City Literary Center, which will have a bookstore, a reading space, a bar, a little restaurant cafe, and places for writing workshops. It's going to be located in these 3 storefronts here on the main street in the north side in a redeveloping complex. So we're really pleased. That's part of our economic development also. And this is where we had originally intended on putting it. There was a nuisance bar here in a house in an empty lot, which we ended up having for structural reasons to remove the buildings. And now we're planning on doing something we call an alphabet reading garden on that site, which is going to, which this sentence right here is going to say in 70 languages. When the Chinese poet was here, we asked him, I mean, this guy was like charismatically joyful, and he'd been through things that we can't even begin to imagine. And we said, how can this be? And the poet Toy Derricott began to think about that, and she said, well, you know, joy is an act of resistance. And so that sentence is going to be in 70 languages there, and then there'll be little outdoor performing spaces and things like that. That's a very speculative drawing at this point. Along the way, we challenged the writers in our program and said, how can we protect people around the world? What can Pittsburgh do, and what can we do as an organization that can replicate a little bit of the sanctuary character that we have on the street, but everywhere? And how can we use the web to accomplish the defense of freedom and the celebration of the written word? And we started a magazine called Samsonia Way, which is an online magazine. It's free and you can read it any time. And it's got any number of departments now. You can kind of whiz through them. And there's everything there from, we have 8 correspondents at this point around the world, most of them in exile, a few in the country where it's somewhat dangerous. There's a Cuban correspondent, an Ethiopian who is in exile, the head of Chinese Pen in exile, most of them in exile, but the Cuban writer, for example, got arrested after writing one of our columns. So it's still a very dangerous profession. The magazine has grown in readership over the years. That's the year it started. And you can see it's continuing to grow, where now it's got about 30,000 readers a month. What's happened to the writers? Are we succeeding or failing? That's ultimately the question. The first writer, Wang Zhang, is now living in New York. His wife got a job there at a college, and we commissioned a translation of his first really good translation here. The University of California published it. They're about to reissue it again. It's sold out. And on the right, Wang Zhang wrote a book about Pittsburgh in Chinese. So I haven't read it all yet, but I see brackets there. It's like a combination of a gossip column and some kind of abstract philosophical essay, because you see it's a crazy kind of book. The second writer, Horacio Castellanos Moya, is now teaching creative writing at the University of Iowa, which is considered the best writing program in the United States. And he's published, I think there's been 5 of his books now translated into English. The third writer, Ket Marr, is in Washington, D.C. now. She and her family, she's working as a broadcast journalist at Radio Free Asia, and that's her with Aung San Suu Kyi when she came to Washington recently. The current writer, Israel Centeno, is from Venezuela. We commissioned the first translation in English of his work and published a little chapbook last year. Well, actually, a student at Chatham University in a publishing program published it, called Bamboo City. And we're now in the process of translating a novel of his called El Complot, which landed him in a lot of trouble with the late Hugo Chavez back in a long time ago. And he lost his job and began to just run down. His wife lost his job, his kids got thrown out of college. And so he is the current writer in our program. Questions? We won't do any kind of neat roundup here. Are there any questions, suggestions, ideas for us, and ways we can connect better? I would appreciate any of those. Yes?
Where does your funding come?
I raise the money. Comes from members of the public, foundations. A little bit of it comes from places like the National Endowment for the concerts and things like that. So those are the primary ways. One of the reasons we're starting this literary center is we hope we can figure out a way to make some money out of the bar, bookstore, restaurant to help support some of the programs. But all those different ways. If there are no other questions, thank you very much. And live your life, defend speech, use your speech responsibly. It can be taken away.
Henry, thank you. You know, we gathered here 6-ish hours ago, 5-ish hours ago, whatever it was. you know, and what we, oh, Henry, I had to give you something. This is our token of appreciation. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for coming over. Thank you. We promised you 5.5 or 6 hours ago, whatever it was, that we hoped beyond anything else today that you, A, learned more about the First Amendment, but maybe more importantly, gained an appreciation or a better appreciation for it. As I said to you, those of you who were in the room a couple of hours ago, going back to the conversation we had at dinner with a few of us last night, I think there's sort of the First Amendment this way, meaning journalism, and the First Amendment this way, meaning art and expression and that sort of thing. I think if there's a theme that you've heard each presenter state today, I think I can summarize it in a sentence or two, and that is, it doesn't exist everywhere, and it can stand for a lot of things. Freedom of the press, freedom of speech, the ability to criticize the government, the ability to criticize something in a principled way, certainly not in a mean-spirited or derogatory way. But like anything else, it's only as strong as you make it. You know, I read something, was told something not too long ago, that about 25% of the population knows what the First Amendment is. 1 in 4 knows what the First Amendment is. Something like 13% of the population, a little more than 1 in 10, can name the 5 freedoms contained in the First Amendment. And someone who was at dinner with me last night jokingly said, but I bet you everybody could tell you what the Second Amendment is. And one of the reasons is because the Second Amendment's in the news a lot. And for some reason, people say, you can't mess with my guns, but you can mess with my speech. Don't mess with my guns, but you can mess with those journalists. Don't mess with my guns, but my religion is better than your religion. Well, my response every time I hear that is, it's the First Amendment for a reason. It's first for a reason. But it only maintains the strength of being number one if all of us feed it, and all of us strengthen it, and all of us believe in it. We hope that's the message that got through today. For those of you who were able to stick around the entire day, thank you. Again, to my colleagues, Heather, Carrie, Michael, who was in here a couple of minutes ago, and the students, some of whom are here, some of whom are outside, my thanks for what has been a tremendously enjoyable day for me, and I hope an informative and enjoyable day for you guys as well. Safe travels back to your high schools, and please stay in touch.